For me, there's no direct relationship between the two, but there are lots of perhaps temporary relationships between the two. There's no fundamental reason why one should trump the other as a kind of general rule. I mean, I would say that storytelling is probably one of the most ancient forms of human activity, and any given technological innovation tends to have a much shorter lifespan, although the book's doing pretty well. So for me, there are often technological factors in either the origination of an opportunity, like I had to make that film that we've just seen, the way that you might bring a particular story to a screen, of course, is a technological process, although filmmaking is still mostly a kind of 1900 era technological process. I mean, mostly, of course, we're not putting film through the camera as much as we were, but fundamentally dragging cameras around and lighting things, and with the exception of some computer-generated stuff and the fact that we're just now starting to move away from film, nothing all that much has really changed, technologically speaking, in terms of how we're putting things together. So for me, I'd emphasize the continuity rather than the novelty of the visual storytelling technique. And as I was saying earlier, in some instances, the very latest technological developments take us back in terms of visual style, in fact, several decades, in terms of how those stories are told. So I would say there are from moment to moment, from year to year, and decade to decade, there will always be fluctuations in the way people access the stories, in the opportunities that those different kinds of access give the storytellers. And one of the obvious differences will be in duration, because at the moment, because there's an explosion of the use of the internet as a distribution mechanism, and download speeds aren't optimal yet. That means that images have to be compressed. Screen sizes are relatively small, say on YouTube, and there is a limit to how long people will wait while their film downloads, which puts a limit on the maximum duration that a successful piece of web content can have. But that's purely as a result of download speeds and video compression rates. And anyone would tell you that those two things are constantly improving. So I can imagine a point not too far in the future where download speed and compression rate have become irrelevant, and you can have HD or 2K material on your computer on demand. And at that point, why would you necessarily choose to watch a 2 or 3 minute clip on YouTube as opposed to watching Apocalypse Now? If you've got the time and the inclination, you might well just think, I feel like watching Apocalypse Now, press the button and there it is. So that's my answer.
I think the difference is that my big question is the audience controls content now because of technology. You can watch something and stop and start it whenever, and that's the big difference. So your content has to be really good, and then if it's really good, then the world can spread it for free, and that's the big difference. The internet is a photocopier. It just takes one bit of content up there, and the world can spread it. And
the audience controls the content, but it's also a kind of marketing strategy, because behind or next to this 6 films the director directed for the Parliament project, there were another initiative called Tell It Your Way.
Yeah, I mean, that was amazing. 600 people in the world made little short films, 3 minutes, 6 lines of dialogue, minimal violence and, mild sexuality. And of those 600, 314 were passed the tests, and we sat through all of them and whittled it down to about 10%, about 33, I think it was. And that came down to about 5 through RSA, and Ridley Scott chose the winner, Keenan Wilson's Porcelain Unicorn, which is definitely worth checking out. And that drove the whole campaign right through to now. That's what I could say.
And also this whole campaign was organized over a Facebook page.
60,000 subscribers now on Facebook on the Philips page. And that's the really interesting thing. I think all brands now have got their fans that follow them. And I was pushing for the brand to have an iPhone app so they could push content. For every time they do a campaign, they could just push the content to their subscribers, any new films. I mean, they're hopefully do that next time, but this time it was just you subscribe to it through your news feed on Facebook, and they have a Twitter page as well.
Barney, the filmmaking has already been influenced by video games, not especially yours, but maybe the other one we saw before, The Gift, is a little bit influenced in that way. The game industry every day fights for the highest technological standards and advanced animation. How can filmmakers, or should filmmakers, compete with these tendencies, or should they ignore it, or how should they react on it? Is it the right way, or is your relatively classical visual way the right way?
Oh, I think it depends on the filmmaker and the story they're trying to tell. I mean, clearly there's an ongoing symbiotic relationship between the film and video game industries, whereby films become video games and video games sometimes become films. And certainly it's true that the role of digital animation is getting ever bigger in the film industry, because it enables us to create visual effects that previously would have been unthinkable, and that video games are one of the drivers of that. But so too are, for example, the automotive industry. A lot of the three-dimensional computer graphics programs that are used in cinema were originated for doing things like designing cars and aircraft, where there was an industrial reason to be able to create three-dimensional shapes in a computer and then spin them around. So I think from a technological point of view, you have to take whatever is appropriate for your story, and I would hope that there will always be stories out there in the marketplace for people to view that have that are saturated in computer game related images, and also stories which are completely devoid of them. So I would hope that there's not going to just be a convergence whereby films are only viable when there's this video game spin-off, even though obviously for some kind of films that does play a big part in their genesis.
Do you have some idea about the secrets of your own storytelling? What are the core values, the structure, or the narration?
Yeah,
what is it for you, the secret of storytelling?
I've got kind of a theory that fundamentally narrative hasn't changed that much over the last many hundreds of years. Shakespeare's plays are still pretty gripping. The Greek myths are still pretty gripping. Even the kind of more fragmented episodic structure of some web content's delivery isn't necessarily all that different from the way that Dickens's novels were initially published. So for me, I think that the essence of narrative is really determined by how you grip your audience. And I was talking to a neuroscientist who's also an author recently, a guy called David Eagleman, who wrote a really good book called Sum. And he was describing the human brain as being fundamentally well disposed to receiving narrative and making narrative. And that was one of the key distinguishing features of the human brain, was that it liked to make stories out of things. And certainly we like to make stories out of our own lives, even when they're actually often quite fragmented and disparate. So for me, just speaking personally, I think there's a kind of fundamental human desire for narrative completeness, satisfying narratives. Doesn't mean they always have to have happy endings, but that as a viewer, you need to feel like you're in safe hands when you're being told a story, that you're being told something by an author who will guide you through an experience, whether it's positive or negative, a story that will surprise you in some way, that will give you some experience of characters who you believe in and care about, and that whether those characters are being represented by computer-generated animation or actors recorded on celluloid or pieces of a few black pixels on your Kindle reader against a few white pixels, I think fundamentally it doesn't change the natural tendency for humans to want to listen to stories and be told them.
Jack, do you find this fundamental need for storytelling in every video footage you get from the audience or from your users in the project?
No, because the people who are contributing aren't necessarily telling a story. They're kind of offering up footage that could be used in the service of a kind of overarching narrative. I think in terms of storytelling, it's a sort of rare film. I don't imagine it'll be the model for future films.
The storytelling may be the kind of, or the art of editing this material.
I think that's right. I think that's right. But then again, obviously one of the, I mean, there's obviously a broad spectrum between kind of entirely authored by one person and something which is created in the way that we're creating this film. But the decisions people are making as to what to show and what is important to them and what they want to record and so on are analogous to the decisions that are made, you know, in any storytelling. So I guess there's definitely a relationship there.
Okay, are there any questions? There it is.
I have a question about the symbiotic relationship between games industry and movie industry. You said before that with 3D technology, filmmaking is going back to a more classical style, to a slower pace of storytelling, whereas game cinematic telling is very fast-paced, very shortcuts. Does that mean that they are drifting apart again, or is...
Not necessarily, because I think one of the big drivers of the sales of, for example, 3D TVs is going to be people who want to play 3D video games. So I think, in a sense, the 3D screen technology is going to affect both industries. And one question that I don't have an answer to, but I think about sometimes, is whether the requirement to tell stories slower, to have the shots run longer and have the focus be deeper and things like that in 3D material is kind of permanent or temporary, in that if you look at the average length of a shot in any given film, over decades it reduces enormously. I mean, there are still obviously very long, slow, perhaps more art house kind of films made today, but as a kind of on a kind of scientific basis, the average shot length has got massively shorter. And so you might expect that there'll be the same tendency with 3D, and that once people have got used to watching things in 3D, they'll be able to digest those images that much quicker, and that the same process will apply. But we don't know. It may be that we'll reach a limit in 3D where it just requires that extra bit of time perennially, and then things will be slower.
There's another question.
Good afternoon. Perhaps foolishly this morning on a panel, I predicted that 3D television would be slow to be adapted because there'd be a reluctance by viewers at home to wear glasses, and that perhaps it would take another 10 years until technology existed that would be more like holograms, so that you watched without glasses. Is that a foolish projection? And I have a supplementary question.
Okay, well, I mean, on that question, I've been asked that a lot since making this film in 3D, which unfortunately you've only seen in standard definition 2D. But to my mind, there is a huge audience. You probably know better than us. There's a huge audience for 3D feature films, and I understand that the exhibition of 3D feature films is disproportionately profitable, and so that, you know, if you've got a feature film that's of a certain size, you may as well make it in 3D because it'll make financial sense. I think given that there'll be a constant flow of 3D content, and given that people will, go and see that in the cinema and are used to being able to access that same content they've seen in the cinema shortly thereafter in their home, I think that it's hard to imagine why people wouldn't choose, when upgrading their TV, and so obviously it takes a little while, why they wouldn't choose one with a 3D capability. So my personal view is that it'll eventually be like color, in that if I asked you whether your TV at home can do color, you'd look at me a bit strangely, but it's not that many decades ago that was a serious question. And so I think eventually 3D will just be something that people's TVs can do, and that they take that for granted. Whether they watch 3D content all that much remains to be seen. I doubt they'll be watching chat shows in 3D or cookery programs in 3D. But for the kind of bigger, more cinematic experiences where it's worth putting your glasses on and dimming the lights, I think that does have a future, yeah.
I was going to say that there is already a mobile